Sorry about that. Welcome to part 12 of R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. We are at page... I think it's 110. No, we must have gone to 120. I believe, I read into this page. So, starting from page 120, subsection Hegel. Swiss writer Edward Frotter says that philosophy of history, which traces the course of human life from its beginning to the end of the world and to the last judgment, as medieval thinkers did, is a respectable and dignified thing. But Hegel's philosophy of history, which makes history end not with the last judgment, but with the present day, only ends in glorifying and idealizing the present, denying that any further progress is possible, and providing a pseudo-philosophical justification for a policy of rigid and unintelligent conservatism. But here again, Hegel, like Fichte, is surely in the right. The philosophy of history is, according to this idea, history itself, according to his idea of it, history itself philosophically considered, that is, seen from the inside. But the historian has no knowledge of the future. What documents, what evidence has he from which to ascertain facts that have not yet happened? And the more philosophically he looks at history, the more clearly he recognizes that the future is and always must be closed book to him. History must end with the present because nothing else has happened. But this does not mean glorifying the present or thinking that the future progress is impossible. It only means recognizing the present as a fact and realizing that we do not know what the future progress will be. As Hegel put it, the future is an object of not of knowledge, but of hopes and fears. And hopes and fears are not history. If Hegel, in the practical politics of his later life, was an unintelligent conservative, that was the fault of Hegel as a man. There is no reason to regard it as the fault of his philosophy of history. But although these points Hegel seems to be in the right as against his critics, it is impossible to read his philosophy of history without feeling that, magnificent work though it is, it has great faults. I do not refer merely to Hegel's ignorance of the many historical facts that have been discovered since his time. I refer to something deeper in the very method and fabric of his work. It is a striking fact, and one which many readers have noticed, that as an historian, Hegel was at his best in the lectures on the history of philosophy, which are a genuine triumph of historical method and have been the model for all subsequent histories of thought. This means that his method is based as it was on the principle that all history is the history of thought, was not only legitimate but brilliantly successful when the subject matter with which he was dealing with was thought at its purest, i.e., philosophical thought. But this is not the subject matter of his philosophy of history. Hegel himself held that there are many kinds of thought, and that they differ in degree as more or less perfect examples of rationality. At the bottom comes what he calls the subjective mind, the kind of thought that psychology deals with, where thought is hardly more than the living organism's consciousness of its own sensations. Next, higher on the scale, comes what he calls objective mind, where thought expresses itself by creating outward manifestations of itself in social and political systems. Then, at the top, comes absolute mind, in its three forms of art, religion, and philosophy. These all transcend the sphere of social and political life and overcome the opposition between subject and object, the thinker and the institution or law which he finds in existence and has to obey. A work of art, a religious belief, or a philosophical system is perfectly free and at the same time a perfectly objective expression of the mind that conceives it. Now, in the philosophy of history, Hegel is restricting the field of his study to political history. Here he is following Kant. But Kant had a good reason for doing this, and Hegel had not. On the strength of his distinction between phenomena and things in themselves, Kant, as we have seen, regarded historical events as phenomena, events in a time series of which the historian is a spectator. Human actions, as things in themselves, are in his view moral actions, and he thought that the same actions which, as things in themselves, were moral actions were, as phenomena, political actions. Hence, history must and only can be the history of politics. When Hegel repudiated the Kantian distinction between phenomena and things in themselves, he repudiated, by implication, the Kantian doctrines that all history is political history and that history is a spectacle. Hence, the central position of the state in his philosophy of history is anachronism, and has to be consistent with it himself. He ought to have held that the historian's business is to study not so much the process of objective mind as the history of absolute mind, i.e., art, religion, and philosophy. And in fact, nearly half of Hegel's collected works is devoted to the study of these three things. The philosophy of history is an illogical excrescence on the corpus of Hegel's works. The legitimate fruit of his revolution in historical method, so far as that fruit has been found in his own writings, is the 8 volumes entitled Aesthetics, Philosophy of Religion, History of Philosophy. The ordinary criticism of Hegel is therefore mistaken, beginning with the recognition that his philosophy of history is somehow unsatisfactory, which everyone must admit. It argues, this is what comes of treating history as rational. The moral is that history is not human thought developing itself, it is just brute fact. The right criticism would run, this is what comes of treating political history by itself as if it were the whole of history. The moral is that the political developments should be conceived by the historian as integrated with economic, artistic, religious, and philosophical developments, and that the historian should not be content with any short of a history of a man in his concrete actuality. In point of fact, this second criticism was the only one which would seem consciously or unconsciously to have influenced certain 19th century historians. Subsection 8. Hegel and Marx. The 19th century historiography did not abandon Hegel's belief that history is rational. To do that would have been to abandon history itself, but rather aimed at achieving a history of concrete mind by insisting on the elements which in his formal philosophy of history Hegel had neglected, and working on them in a solid whole. Of his more immediate disciples, Bauer specialized in the history of Christian doctrine and Marx in the history of economic activity, while Rank was later to apply systematically his conception of historical movements or periods as the realization of a conception or idea such as Protestantism. Capitalism in Marx, or Protestantism in Rank is an idea in the true Hegelian sense, a thought, a conception of man's life held by man himself, and thus akin to a Kantian category. But a category historically conditioned, a way in which people come to think at a certain time and in accordance with which they organize their whole life, only to find that the ideas change by a dialectic of its own into a different idea, and that the manner of life which expressed it will not hold together, but breaks up and transforms itself into an expression of a second idea which replaces the first. Hegel's view of history has both the strength and the weakness of Hegel's. Its strength in penetrating behind the facts to the logical nexus of an underlying concepts, its weakness in selecting one aspect of human life, in Hegel the political, and in Marx the economic, as in the sense fully rational by itself. Marx, like Hegel, insisted that human history is not a number of different parallel histories, economic, political, artistic, religious, and so on, but one single history. But like Hegel again, he conceived this unity not as an organic unity in which every thread of the developing process was preserved its own continuity, as well as its intimate connection with the others, but as a unity in which there was only one continuous thread. In Hegel, the thread of political history; in Marx, that of economic history. The other factors having no continuity of their own but being, for Marx, at every point in their development, mere reflections of the basic economic fact. This committed Marx to the paradox that if certain people held, for example, certain philosophical views, they had no philosophical reasons for holding them, but only economic reasons. Historical studies of politics, of art, of religion, of philosophy, constructed on this principle, can have no real historical value. They are mere exercises in ingenuity, where, for example, the real and important problem of discovering the connection between Quakerism and banking is burked by saying, in effect, that Quakerism is only the way in which bankers think about banking. The Marxian paradox, however, is only symptomatic of an anti-historical naturalism which infects much of his thought and can best be illustrated by reference to his attitude to Hegel's dialectic. Marx made a famous boast that he had taken Hegel's dialectic and stood it on its head. But he did not mean quite what he said. Hegel's dialectic begins with thought and goes on to nature and ends with mind. Hegel did not invert this order. He referred to the first and second terms only, not to the third. And when he meant, whereas Hegel's dialectic began with thought and went on to nature, his own dialectic began with nature and went on to thought. Marx was not a philosophical ignoramus, and he did not for a moment suppose that the priority of thought over nature in Hegel meant that Hegel regarded nature as a product of mind. He knew that Hegel, like himself, regarded mind as a product, a dialectical product, of nature. He knew that the word thought, in the sense in which Hegel called logic the science of thought, meant not that which thinks, but that which it thinks. I'm going to read that again. Meant not that which thinks, but that which it thinks. So not the thinker, but what it's thinking about. Logic for Hegel is not a science of how we think, it is a science of Platonic forms, abstract entities, ideas. If we remember to take seriously Hegel's own warning that we must not suppose ideas to exist only in people's heads, that would be subjective idealism, a thing Hegel abominated. They only got into people's heads, according to him, because people were able to think. And if the ideas had not been independent of people's thinking them, there would have not been any people or indeed any world of nature either. Because these ideas were the logical framework within which alone a world of nature and of men, of unthinking beings and thinking beings, was possible. These ideas not only made a framework for nature, they also made a framework for history. History, as the actions in which man expressed his thoughts, had the general outlines of its structure laid down for it in advance by the conditions under which the thinking activity, mind, alone can exist. Among these conditions are the two following. First, that mind should arise within and continue to inhabit a world of nature. Secondly, it should work by apprehending those necessities which lie behind nature. Accordingly, the historical activities of man, as activities that take place or go on in a natural environment, and could not go on otherwise. But their content, i.e., what in particular people think and what in particular people do by way of expressing this thought, is determined not by nature, but by the ideas, the necessities studied by logic. Thus, logic is the key to history, in the sense that men's thoughts and actions, as studied by history, follow a pattern which is the colored version of the pattern logic has already drawn in black and white. This is what Marx was thinking of when he said that he had turned Hegel's dialectic upside down. When he made that statement, what he had in mind was history, perhaps the only thing in which Marx was much interested. And the point of his remark was that whereas for Hegel, because logic came before nature, it was for logic to determine the pattern on which history worked, and for nature only to determine the environment in which it worked. For Marx himself, nature was more than the environment of history. It was the source from which its pattern was derived. It was no use, he thought, to draw patterns for history out of logic, like like the famous Hegelian pattern for the 3 stages of freedom. For the Oriental world, one is free. For the Greco-Roman world, some are free. For the modern world, all are free. It was better to draw patterns out of the world of nature, as Marx did with his no less famous one of primitive communism, capitalism, and socialism, where the meaning of the terms is professedly derived not from ideas, but from natural facts. What Marx was doing was to reassert the fundamental principle of the 18th century historical naturalism, the principle that historical events have natural causes. He reasserted this principle, no doubt with a difference. The Hegelian side in the pedigree of his thought gave it the right to bear in its arms the term dialectical. The materialism on which he so strongly insisted was not ordinary 18th century materialism. It was dialectical materialism. The difference is not unimportant, but it must not be exaggerated. Dialectical materialism was still materialism. The whole point of Marx's conjure trick with the Hegelian dialectic was according to this: that whereas Hegel had broken away from the historical naturalism of the 18th century and had not indeed achieved, except in a partial way, but at any rate had demanded an autonomous history, for a history that recognized no authority except that of logical necessity might not undeservedly claim the title of autonomous. Marx went back on this demand and subjected history once more to that dominion by natural science from which Hegel had proclaimed it free. The step which Marx took was a retrograde one, but like so many other retrograde steps, it was more retrograde in appearance than it was in reality. For the territory he was evacuating was the territory that had never been effectively occupied. Hegel had demanded an autonomous history, but he had not in fact achieved it. He had seen, as it were prophetically, that history ought, on principle, to be liberated from its pupillage to natural science. But in his own actual historical thinking that liberation had not been fully achieved, But in his own actual historical thinking that liberation had not fully been achieved. It had not been achieved, that is to say, with regard to what he ordinarily called history, i.e., political and economic history, a field in which Hegel was not a master and in which he mainly contented himself with scissor and paste methods. In this history of philosophy, however, and here alone, he did enter into effective occupation of an historical field. And it was here that he must have convinced himself, as he convinced many a reader, that his claim of autonomy for historical thought was in principle justified. That is one reason why dialectical materialism has always had its greatest success with political and economic history, and its greatest failures in the history of philosophy. If Marx's reversal of the Hegelian dialectic was a backward step, it was also a preliminary to an advance. It was based on the reality of the situation which Hegel bequeathed to his pupils, and in particular, it led to a great advance in the handling of that particular kind of history, economic history, in which Hegel was weak and in which Marx was exceptionally strong. If all modern treatment of the history of philosophy goes back to Hegel as the great modern master of the subject, all modern treatment of economic history goes back in the same sense to Marx. Nevertheless, the practice of research can no more be left today where Hegel left it for the history of philosophy, or where Marx left it for the economic history, than the theory of history can be left where Hegel left it with his... These were the expedients whereby a type of history which had not passed beyond the scissor and paste stage was attempted to conceal the defects inherent in that stage by the adoption of non-historical methods. They had they belonged to the embryology of historical thought, and the conditions which justified and indeed necessitated them no longer existed. Subsection 9. Positivism. The historical materialism of Marx and his colleagues exercised little immediate influence on historical practice, which in the 19th century came more and more to suspect all philosophies of history as baseless speculations. This was connected with a general tendency in the same century towards positivism. Positivism may be defined as a philosophy acting in the service of natural science, as in the Middle Age philosophy acted in the service of theology. But the positivists had their own notion, or rather a superficial notion, of what natural science was. They thought it consisted of two things. First, asserting facts. Secondly, framing laws. Facts were immediately ascertained by the sensuous perception, and the laws were framed through generalizing from the facts by induction. Under this influence, a new kind of historiography arose, which might be called positivistic historiography. Throwing themselves with enthusiasm into the first part of the positivist program, historians set to work to ascertain all the facts that they could. The result was a vast increase of detailed historical knowledge, based to an unprecedented degree on the accurate and critical examination of evidence. This was the age in which enriched history by a compilation of vast masses of carefully sifted material, like the calendar of clothes and patent rolls, the corpus of Latin inscriptions, the new edition of historical texts, and sources of every kind, and the whole apparatus of archaeological research. The best historian, like Mommsen or Maitland, became the greatest master of detail. The historical conscience identified itself with an infinite scrupulosity about any and every isolated matter of fact. The ideal of universal history was swept aside as a vain dream, and the ideal of historical literature became the monograph. But through this period, there was a certain uneasiness about the ultimate purpose of this detailed research. It had been undertaken in obedience to the spirit of positivism, according to which the ascertaining of facts was only the first stage of a process, whose second stage was the discovery of laws. The historians themselves, for the most part, were quite happy going on ascertaining new facts. The field for discovery was inexhaustible, and they had asked nothing better than to explore it. But philosophers who understood the positivist program looked on this enthusiasm with misgiving. When they asked, were the historians going to embark on the second stage? And at the same time, ordinary people who were not specialists in theory became bored, and specialists in history became bored. They did not see that it mattered whether this or that fact were discovered or not, and a gulf gradually widened between the historian and the ordinary intelligent man. Positivist philosophers complained that so long as it stuck to mere facts, history was not scientific. Ordinary men complained that these facts which it was bringing to light were not interesting. These two complaints came to much the same thing. Each implied that the mere ascertaining of facts for their own sake was unsatisfactory, and that its justification lay beyond itself in something further that could or should be done with the facts thus ascertained. It was in this situation that Auguste Comte demanded that historical facts should be used as the raw material of something more important and more genuinely interesting than themselves. Every natural science, said the positivists, began by ascertaining facts and then went on to discover their historical connections. Accepting this assertion, Comte proposed that there should be a new science called sociology, which was to begin by discovering the facts about human life, this being the work of historians, and go on to discover the causal connections between these facts. The sociologist would thus be a kind of superhistorian, raising history to the rank of a science by thinking scientifically about the same facts about which the historian only thought empirically. This program was very like the Kantian and post-Kantian program for interpreting hordes of facts into a grandiose philosophy of history. The only difference was that for the idealist, this projected superhistory was to be based on the conception of mind as something peculiar and different from nature, whereas for the positivists, it was based on the conception of mind as in no way fundamentally different from nature. Historical process for the positivists was in kind identical with natural process, and that was why the methods of natural history or natural science were applicable in the interpretation of history. This program appears at first sight to throw away with one single careless gesture all the advances which the 18th century had so laboriously made in the understanding of history. But this was not actually the case. The new positivistic denial of a fundamental distinction between nature and history really implied not so much a rejection of the 18th century conception of history as a criticism of the 18th century conception of nature. One indication of this is that the 19th century thought in general, hostile though it was to much of Hegel's philosophy of history, was far more fundamentally hostile to his philosophy of nature. Hegel, as we have seen, regarded differences between higher and lower organisms as logical, not temporal. He thus rejected the idea of evolution. But in the generation after his death, the life of nature began to be thought of as a progressive life, and that to the extent of a life resembling the life of history. In 1859, when Darwin published The Origin of Species, this conception was not new. In scientific circles, the conception of nature as a static system, where all species were, in the old phrase, special creations, had long been superseded by the conception of a species as coming into the idea of existence in a time process. The novelty of Darwin's idea was not that he believed in evolution, but that he held it to be brought about by what he called natural selection, a process akin to the artificial selection by which man improves the breeds of domestic animals. But in the popular mind, this was not clearly recognized. Darwin came to stand as the champion and indeed inventor of the very idea of evolution. In its general effect on thought, The Origin of Species thus figures as the book which first informed everyone that the old idea of nature as a static system had been abandoned. The effect of this discovery was vastly to increase the prestige of historical thought. Hitherto, the relation between historical and scientific thought, i.e., thought about history and thought about nature, had been antagonistic. History demanded for itself a subject matter essentially progressive, science one essentially static. With Darwin, the scientific point of view capitulated to the historical, and both now agreed in conceiving their subject matter as progressive. Evolution could now be used as a generic term for covering both historical progress and natural progress. The victory of evolution in scientific circles meant that the positivistic reduction of history to nature was qualified by a partial reduction of nature to history. This rapprochement had its dangers. It tended to injure the natural science by leading to the assumption that natural evolution was automatically progressive, creative by its own law of better and better forms of life, and it might have injured history through the assumption that historical process depended on the same so-called law of nature, and that the methods of natural science, in its new evolutionary form, were adequate to study the historical process. What prevented this injury to history was the fact that historical method had now found itself and become a far more definite, systematic, and self-conscious thing than it had been half a century earlier. The historians of the early and middle 19th century had worked out a new method of handling sources, the method of philological criticism. Up to page 130 of R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. I will pop out the chat to see what everybody's saying. If you were listening to the audiobook, now is the time to skip to the next chapter. If the next chapter hasn't been made yet, I'm sorry. Yo, what up, God EXE? What up, Raven? What up, Muhammad? What up, Casso? What up, Aditya? Yeah, what up, After Hours? Sorry, I know I have radio voice. What up? Who knows? Yeah, that was R.G. Collingwood's idea of history. I really enjoy this book. It's really good. Oh my god, so tired. Barely got any sleep. This book is really good for good criticism of historical thought throughout time. So far, we started with kind of like the basic, with prehistory, or the first formings of history. And something I've noticed that happens a lot online is I'm someone that loves old Greek philosophy. I love tons of different philosophies, but I've noticed that there tends to be a certain reverence for old things, and people will say, like, take Stoicism and like be like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. It's like, dude, that's a 2,000-year-old philosophy. Update yourself. That was based on people that didn't know anything really. They had some small idea of what human life was like, but we have built up so much more since then. It's not good to base your life on philosophies from thousands of years ago that were made for their time and for their place, when we have a whole new world, whole new way of interacting with people. We're no longer these little state countries anymore. We're a global economy, and we can't treat ourselves as being little city nations anymore, So that's the problem with a lot of these gurus that I see online. They'll read old mystical literature and then try to apply it to modern times. It's like, well, it's cute, but you're doing a lot more harm than good when you try to force an ancient system on modern behavior. Especially since a lot of them were wrong, like blatantly freaking wrong. If you read the Republic, his idea of how he should have his society and how that stuff works is, yeah, it was great for the time, 2,500 years ago, 2,300 years ago. But there are tons of problems that people have already, dealt with in those works that, it makes me sad that when people see the little bit of good in something, and then instead of just taking that little bit of good, they take the whole system with its bad and run with the whole system. With any type of fundamentalism, or like the Bible only type thing, because like I grew up with that type of thing where it's like, if it's not in the Bible, I don't believe it. Well, that's stupid. The Bible is not. It's not even a book of philosophy. It's not a book of science. It's a book of myths that are compiled from various religions that eventually got turned into Judaism, and then eventually from Judaism into Christianity. And from Christianity, it got turned into the Holy Roman Empire's religion. So don't base your thoughts on something that's applied 2,000 years ago. It's very interesting that but also the same thing that I've noticed a lot of people when thinking or talking about ancient peoples or historical events, they take our own modern look and view of things or way of thinking, and they place it on those characters, where it's like, no, they were people of their time that had their own way of being and thinking. If you try to think, oh, they were just like me, no, they weren't. They had completely different upbringing, completely different environment, completely different way of being. We have to study them as themselves, not put our own biases of what we think they are because of what we think we are. I've seen that a lot too, with a lot of gurus online that, like, oh yeah, so we're gonna read the Bhagavad Gita or something like that, and we're and like they start taking, it's like the ancient aliens kind of mentality. They're reading too hard into something that's obviously a metaphor, and they're taking it literally. Anyways, I'm gonna stop rambling at this point. I hope y'all have a good day, because I got to get going for work. I'll see y'all tomorrow.